Hi, folks. Today I thought I would read some excerpts from the novel The Naked and the Dead by Norman Mailer. It was written about the Second World War. Mailer was an infantryman in the Pacific for 2 years, and then he wrote the book once he got out of the Army. He was 25 years old at the time he wrote it. I think what impressed me about the whole thing is, well, and I suppose this is true of any great novel, it addresses issues that speak to us even in these modern times, 50, 60 years after it was written. And I wanted to read some passages about the nature of human relations. This is the book. It's well worth a read. A lot of interesting stuff in it. The setup for this little excerpt is there's a lieutenant named Hearn. He's 20 years old, 22 years old, just barely got out of college. And he's been chosen as the aide to a general named Cummings, who is a career officer. Cummings has an interest in Hearn in sort of convincing Hearn that his fascist sort of views are actually the wave of the future. And there are a number of interviews in which, well, basically lectures in which the general lectures Hearn about the nature of human relationships, the nature of the war. And I have sort of these are sort of strung out through the novel, but I'm going to condense them together almost as if they were one conversation. The general speaks first. When I was your age, a little older, the type of thing that preoccupied me was what makes a nation fight well. Hearn responds, I imagine it would be a kind of identity between the people and the country, whether it's for good reasons or bad. The general shook his head. That's a liberal historian's attitude. You'd be surprised what a tiny factor that is. There are just two main elements. A nation fights well in proportion to the amount of men and material it has. And the other equation is that the individual soldiers in the army is a more effective soldier the poorer his standard of living has been in the past. Fondness for a country is all very lovely. It even is a moral factor at the beginning of a war. But fighting emotions are very undependable, and the longer a war lasts, the less value they have. After a couple of years of war, there are only two considerations that make a good army: a superior material force and a poor standard of living. Why do you think a regiment of Southerners is worth 2 regiments of Easterners? I'm not peddling theories. This is an observation, and the conclusion leaves me, as a general officer, in a poor position. We have the highest standard of living in the world, and as one would expect, the worst individual fighting soldiers of any big power. Or at least in their natural state they are. They're comparatively wealthy. They're spoiled. And as Americans, they share, most of them, the particular manifestation of our democracy. They have an exaggerated idea of the rights due to themselves as individuals, and no idea at all of the rights due others. It's the reverse of the peasant. And I'll tell you right now, it's the peasant who makes the soldiers. So what you've got to do is break them down, Hearn said. Exactly, break them down. Every time an enlisted man sees an officer get an extra privilege, it breaks him down a little more. I don't see that. It seems to me they'd hate you more. They do. But they also fear us more. I don't care what kind of man you give me. If I have him long enough, I will make him afraid. Every time there's what you call an army injustice, The enlisted man involved is confirmed a little more in the idea of his own inferiority. And that basically was what their relationship had always been. Hearn understood at this moment. He had been the pet, the dog to the master, coddled and curried, thrown sweetmeats until he had had the presumption to bite the master once. And since then he had been tormented with a particular absorbed sadism that most men could generate only towards an animal. He was a diversion for the general, and he resented it deeply with a cold, speechless anger that came to some extent from the knowledge that he had acquiesced in the dog role. He had even had the dog's dreams, carefully submerged, of someday equaling the master, and Cummings had probably understood even that, had been amused. Cummings sat back enjoying himself. We're wandering a little far afield. I was going to explain the war to you. I like to call it a process of historical energy. There are countries which have latent power, latent resources. They are full of potential energy, so to speak. And there are great concepts which can unlock that, express it, as kinetic energy. A country is organization, coordinated effort. Your epithet, fascism. He moved his chair slightly. Historically, the purpose of this war is to translate America's potential into kinetic energy. The concept of fascism, far sounder than communism, if you consider it, for it's grounded firmly in man's actual nature, merely started in the wrong country, and a country which did not have enough intrinsic potential power to develop completely. In Germany, with that basic frustration of limited physical means, there was bound to be excesses. But the dream, the concept was sound enough. Cummings wiped his mouth. As you put it, Robert, not too badly, there's a process of osmosis. America is going to absorb that dream. It's in the business of doing it now. When you've created power, materials, armies, they don't wither away of their own accord. Our vacuum as a nation is filled with released power, and I can tell you that we're out of the backwater of history now. The truth of it is that from man's very inception, there has been one great vision, blurred first by the exigencies and cruelties of nature, and then, as nature began to be conquered, by the second great cloak, economic fear and economic striving. That particular vision has been muddled and diverted, but we are coming to a time when our techniques will enable us to achieve it. There's that popular misconception of man as something between a brute and an angel. Actually, man is in transit between brute and God. Man's deepest urge is omnipotence, Hearn says. Yes, it's not religion. That's obvious. It's not love. It's not spirituality. Those are all sops along the way, benefits we devised for ourselves when the limitations of our existence turned us away from the other dream, to achieve God. When we came kicking into the world, we are God. The universe is the limit of our senses. And when we get older, when we discover that the universe is not us, it's the deepest trauma of our existence. I've been trying to impress you, Robert, that the only morality of the future is a power morality, and a man who cannot find his adjustment to it is doomed. There's one thing about power. It can flow only from the top down. When there are little surges of resistance at the middle level, it merely calls for more power to be directed downward to burn it out. Hearn was looking at his hands. We're not in the future yet. You can consider the Army, Robert, as a preview of the future. That last sentence reminds me of a quote of George Orwell. He said, if you want to imagine the future, imagine a boot stepping on a human face. kind of my response in reading this is, well, it puts everything in perspective. The ruling class of this country has been trying to consolidate its power all the way back as far as the Second World War. I think in recent times they've been pretty successful. You know, their continuous, relentless efforts are starting to bear significant fruit. Essentially, with the idea of $1, one vote, that spending money is the same as free speech. They have completely corrupted the idea of democracy. Um, Again, this is an Orwell quote, you know, all pigs are equal, but some pigs are more equal than others. That's right. Some of these pigs have millions of votes. You only get one or two. Another idea is that somehow corporations, these huge economic entities, are to be treated legally as if they were people that have the same rights and privileges as living, breathing people. Interestingly enough, they're not endowed with any of the responsibilities of living, breathing people. If a corporation kills 1 or 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people, maybe they get fined, maybe they get some bad press and their stock price drops, but they're not put out of business. They're not killed. They're not, the shareholders are not thrown into jail somewhere. So they've got all the privileges and none of the responsibilities. In a lot of sense, the world as the world that Cummings was trying to create, they've created. I really don't know what the hell we're going to do to do about it at this point. I'm an old guy. I really have to kind of bundle up all this and plop it in some young woman's lap. Sorry about that. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. Bye.